The main street of Dust Devil Creek was a sun-scorched, bleached bone of a place exuding quiet desperation, simmering grief, and the taste of unspoken cruelty. Lillian Hayes stood in the oppressive heat holding a worn wooden box as if it were the last prayer she had left. Inside, nestled in yellowed tissue paper, lay her wedding dress. It was the final sacred piece of her husband Samuel, the last piece of a life that had already turned to dust. Her pride was a fortress under siege, but her face was a mask of quiet dignity revealing nothing of the storm within. This was her final gambit. The foreclosure notice nailed to the post was her death warrant signed by Marcus Fletcher himself. She had until sundown. The townsfolk watched her, their pity a sharper sting than their scorn. They saw a woman brought low a grub-line rider begging for scraps, not a wife selling her own heart to save the home they built. They thought they had her dead to rights, but as a lone rider appeared on the horizon, a silhouette shimmering in the heat, the real question wasn't if she would sell the dress, but what the man who bought it would demand in return. The main street of Dust Devil Creek was a sun-scorched, bleached bone of a place, a straight line drawn between a parched earth and a pitiless sky. The air thick with heat, and the taste of fine alkali dust vibrated with unspoken cruelties. It was a town choking on desperation and silent grief, and today that grief had a name. Lillian Hayes. She stood in the oppressive heat near the town's water trough, holding a worn wooden box as if it contained the last prayer she had left. Inside, nestled in yellowed tissue paper that smelled faintly of lavender, and memory, was her wedding dress. It was the final sacred piece of her husband Samuel, the last piece of a life that had already turned to dust 6 months ago. Her pride was a fortress under siege. Her knuckles white where she gripped the box, but her chin was held high, her face a mask of quiet dignity that revealed nothing of the storm within. This was her final gambit, her last stand. The foreclosure notice nailed to the community post was her death warrant, a stark, black-and-white declaration signed by Marcus Fletcher himself. She had until sundown to pay Samuel's debt, or the small ranch they had poured their blood and dreams into would belong to him. The townsfolk watched her. They passed with their gazes averted, or worse, with looks of sharp, pitying curiosity. Shameless Mrs. Gable whispered to her friend as they passed, her voice a dry rustle, loud enough for Lillian to hear. Selling a sacred thing like that, right here in the street. Her friend clucked her tongue. Fletcher will have that land by sundown no matter what. This is just sad. A woman alone has no hope here. Lillian's jaw tightened, but she did not look at them. She kept her eyes fixed on the shifting heat haze at the end of the street. Each whisper was a small stone striking her armor. She was beginning to crack. It was then that Owen Slade rode into town. He was a silhouette against the white-hot glare, dusty and tired, his horse moving with the slow, steady pace of a beast that had seen too many miles. He was not large, nor was he adorned with the flashy silver of a showman gunslinger. There was just a quiet, dangerous stillness about him. His eyes, the color of a stormy sky, swept over the town, once taking in the thirsty horses at the trough, the shuttered windows, the tense set of shoulders on the few men loitering on the boardwalk. His gaze settled on Lillian. He saw the woman, the box, the defiant lift of her chin. Then he saw the foreclosure notice on the post. In the space of a single breath, he understood the entire wretched story. He swung down from his horse, his movements economical and sure. He didn't head for the saloon or the sheriff's office. He walked to the water trough, letting his horse drink, but his attention was elsewhere. He had seen this play before in other sun-bleached towns. A powerful man, a piece of land, and someone helpless being squeezed. A vulture circling a dying calf. It was the way of the world, a way he had long ago accepted with cold, weary cynicism. He was just passing through. It was not his fight. But as he watched, Lillian saw her flinch almost imperceptibly as another group of townsfolk hurried past her. Something shifted. It wasn't pity. Pity was a useless emotion. It was a flicker of something else, a grim recognition, a low simmering anger at the sheer unvarnished injustice of the scene. He had known men like Fletcher, and he had known men like her husband, men who worked the land honestly and died with nothing but debts to show for it. He tied his horse to the rail. The jingle of his spurs was a sharp, sudden sound in the oppressive quiet. Lillian heard the sound and finally lowered her gaze from the horizon. She saw him, a tall, lean stranger, his face shadowed by the brim of a dusty hat. He was looking directly at her, his expression impossible to read. She braced herself for another whispered comment, another look of pity, but he didn't speak. He just started walking toward her. Each step was slow, deliberate, closing the distance. The street seemed to hold its breath. He stopped just a few feet in front of her, the dust from his boots settling on the hem of her worn dress. His stormy eyes met hers, and for the first time she felt seen, not as a widow or a beggar, but as a fighter in the last moments of a losing battle. Owen Slade stopped a few feet from her, the dust from his boots settling on the hem of her worn dress like a fine brown shroud. The street, which had been alive with the low murmur of gossip, fell into a deep, expectant silence. Even the wind seemed to hold its breath. Lillian looked up at him, her heart a frantic drum against her ribs. He was a stranger, tall and lean, his face a landscape of hard angles and planes shadowed by the brim of a dusty hat. But it was his eyes that held her. They were the color of a stormy sky, and in their depths she saw not the pity or scorn she had grown used to, but something else entirely. A profound, world-weary stillness. The dress, he said. His voice was a low gravel rough, but not unkind. It was the voice of a man who did not waste words. How much the directness of the question broke her trance. Her voice, when it came, was a reedy whisper, fragile, but for a single stubborn thread of defiance. $50. It was an impossible sum. It was the exact amount Marcus Fletcher demanded. It was the price of her home. A few townsfolk nearby let out a soft gasp. A quiet, mocking laugh came from the direction of the saloon. $50 for a second-hand dress. The woman was delirious with grief. Owen did not laugh. He did not flinch. He simply reached into a saddlebag he had unslung from his shoulder and pulled out a heavy, oiled leather pouch. He untied the drawstring, and with a motion that was both deliberate and shockingly swift, he tipped a stream of gold coins into his palm. He counted them out one by one. 10, 20, 30, 40, 50. The small ringing sound of each coin hitting his hand was the tolling of a bell for a life she was leaving behind. He stepped forward and poured the coins into her trembling, outstretched hands. The weight of them was real solid. The weight of her salvation and her damnation. "Thank you." She breathed the words barely audible. She clutched the coins, the metal warm against her cold skin, and began to turn away, ready for this public ordeal to be over. She would go to Fletcher's office, throw the gold on his desk, and retreat to the sanctuary of her home, her fortress. "Hold on." The words stopped her cold. They were not loud, but they cut through the air with the sharp finality of a cocked hammer. She turned back to him. Owen had the wooden box with the dress in it, but he hadn't moved to leave. The point of view shifted the world, seen for a moment through his stormy eyes. He saw the flicker of hope in her face curdle into confusion and fear. He saw the townsfolk leaning forward, their faces alight with a fresh, vulture-like curiosity. They thought they knew this story. The wealthy stranger, the desperate woman. It was a tale as old as the dust. He knew how his next words would sound. He knew the cruelty they implied, and he said them anyway. "The deal's not done," he stated, his voice flat. Lillian's heart plummeted. "What do you mean you paid the price?" The full price. I paid for the dress. He corrected his gaze, sweeping over her a slow, calculated assessment that felt like a physical violation. It was a look designed for the audience, a piece of theater. I didn't say when I'd be taking it. He gestured with his head toward the edge of town where a few rough targets were set up for practice. You'll wear it, this afternoon, at the shooting range. A collective gasp rippled through the onlookers. This was worse than they could have imagined. It was a new, unimagined depth of humiliation. Lillian stared at him, the coins in her hand suddenly feeling like hot coals. The man was not a savior. He was a monster, a demon who had come to purchase not just her most sacred memory, but her public shame. The blood drained from her face. She felt dizzy, the sun-scorched street tilting beneath her feet. The whispers of the crowd were a rising tide of venom. Paid for a private show. Has he told you no good would come of her? To wear her wedding dress? For that? Owen's face remained a mask of granite. He gave no explanation. He offered no comfort. He simply stated his terms as if they were matters of freight and shipping. 2 o'clock, he said. Don't be late. He turned then and walked toward his horse, leaving Lillian standing alone in the center of the street, the whispers of the townspeople circling her like buzzards. She held the price of her home in one hand and the cost of her soul in the other. For a long, terrible moment she thought she might break, that she might scream and throw the heavy gold coins into the dust and let Fletcher take everything. But then she thought of Samuel. She thought of the porch swing he had built, the small patch of wildflowers he had planted for her. She thought of the promise she had made to him, a whispered promise at his graveside, that she would not let his memory die, that she would not let his home fall. She straightened her shoulders, a single defiant act against a world determined to break her. Her heart was a cold, hard stone in her chest. She would pay the price. She would endure. And then she would be free. She turned and walked toward the bank, the weight of the gold in her hand a heavy, brutal promise. The coins lay on Lillian's rough-hewn table, a pool of mocking golden light in the gloom of her small ranch house. They were the price of her home, the ransom for her future. But the relief was a hollow, echoing thing. It did not feel like victory. It felt like the first step in a public execution. She walked to the large wooden chest at the foot of her bed, the one Samuel had built for her from fine dark cedar. Her hands trembled as she lifted the lid. There it was. The dress. It wasn't just silk and lace. It was a ghost. The ghost of a sun-drenched wedding day, of Samuel's warm smile, of promises whispered under a boundless sky. A life that felt like it belonged to someone else. A story read in a book. She lifted it from its nest of tissue paper. The fabric was cool and impossibly soft against her calloused fingers. To put it on now felt like a violation, a sacrilege. She was dressing a corpse in the finery of a bride. She was putting on armor for a battle she had already lost. Looking at her reflection in the small, cloudy mirror, she saw a stranger. A woman with Samuel's wife's face, her eyes filled with a grief too deep for tears, her body clad in the uniform of a ghost. She pinned up her hair with hands that did not shake. The trembling was on the inside now, a cold, silent tremor of the soul. The walk into town was the longest of her life. It was a walk to the gallows, each step a slow, deliberate march toward her own humiliation. The townsfolk were already gathering at the edge of town, their curiosity a palpable, buzzing thing. They stared as she approached a vision in white against the drab brown dust. They saw the dress, but they did not see the memory it held. They saw only the scandal, the thrilling, sordid spectacle of her fall. The shooting range was a stark, ugly place, a patch of hard-packed earth littered with shattered bottles, splintered boards, and the faint, acrid smell of spent gunpowder. It was a place of masculine pride and casual violence. Marcus Fletcher was already there, holding court. He leaned against a post, a fine cigar in his mouth, flanked by 2 of his ranch hands. He was the king of this dusty empire, and he radiated a smug, unassailable confidence. When he saw Lillian, his lips curled into a sneer. Well, well, he drawled his voice loud enough for the whole crowd to hear. Look what the cat dragged in. Or should I say what our mysterious stranger paid for? He let his eyes roam over her, a slow, insulting appraisal. Come to watch some real men work Lillian. A pretty little dove like you must get tired of sitting alone in that empty nest. Lillian's face was a mask of pale marble. She said nothing, her silence a thin, fragile shield against his venom. Just then Owen Slade appeared. He walked from the direction of the livery, moving with that same unhurried, purposeful stride. He carried a long, leather-wrapped rifle case. He paid no mind to the crowd and gave Fletcher only a passing glance. His stormy eyes found Lillian, and for a heartbeat his granite expression softened with something she couldn't name. It wasn't pity. It was something harder, something that looked like respect. It gave her a sliver of strength. Owen stopped in the center of the clearing. He set his rifle case down. "This isn't a spectacle, Fletcher," he said, his voice cutting through the murmurs of the crowd. "It's a settlement." Fletcher let out a short, ugly laugh. "A settlement. The debt is paid, stranger. The pretty widow's home is as good as mine. This is just entertainment. The debt was paid with my money." Owen countered, his voice dropping, becoming dangerously quiet. "Which makes the grievance mine now." He took a step forward. "I say the debt was settled under duress. I say the price you put on that land was extortion, and I'm here to challenge it according to the town charter. Article 7. Disputes of honor can be settled by a contest of skill." A shocked silence fell over the crowd. This was no longer just a cruel jest. This was a formal challenge. Owen gestured to Lillian, who stood frozen, a statue in white. "She wears this dress not as a mark of shame," he declared, his voice ringing with authority. "She wears it as a symbol of the home you're trying to steal. A symbol of the Vance honor, the Monroe honor. An honor you'll have to face me for right here and now." Fletcher's sneer faltered. He was caught. To refuse a public challenge in front of the entire town would be an admission of cowardice. His pride, as vast and brittle as the desert itself, would not allow it. He was a fine shot, known for it throughout the territory. He looked at the dusty stranger, then at Lillian, and his confidence returned, twisted into a cruel certainty. "You've got a lot of nerve," Stranger Fletcher spat, pushing himself off the post. "Fine. You want to play games? Let's play. You want the Monroe Dust Bowl? You can have it, if you can outshoot me." He smiled a predator's smile. "But when you lose, and you will lose, the ranch is mine, free and clear. And the dress," he added, his eyes lingering on Lillian with possessive cruelty, "belongs to me, to do with as I please. And you ride out of my town forever." Owen's gaze was as cold and hard as iron. He gave a single sharp nod. "Agreed." The two men stepped up to the line, their pistols heavy on their hips. The crowd held its breath. Lillian stood to the side, a silent, white-clad witness to a battle for her past, her future, her very soul. The air crackled thick with dust and tension, and the promise of a single final shot. The sheriff, a man named Cobb, whose spine was made of dust and political caution, stepped into the center of the clearing. He was a man who preferred paperwork to gunsmoke, but the town charter was clear, and the challenge had been made before a dozen witnesses. He held up his hands for silence. "The terms are set," he announced, his voice thin against the vast open air. "A contest of marksmanship. 3 rounds. The winner takes the deed to the Monroe Ranch, free of all debt. The loser leaves." He cleared his throat, refusing to look at Lillian, who stood like a marble statue in her wedding dress, a ghost at her own wake. "Mr. Fletcher, as the challenged party, you will shoot first." Marcus Fletcher nodded, a smug, predatory grin spreading across his face. He drew his silver-inlaid Colt, a beautiful and deadly weapon, and let it glint in the harsh afternoon sun. He was in his element. This was his stage. "First round, gentlemen," Sheriff Cobb declared, pointing to a fence post 50 yards away, where 6 dark glass bottles stood in a neat row. 6 bottles, 6 shots. Fletcher stepped to the line, basking in the attention of the crowd. Just a little target practice to warm up the arm folks, he boomed, playing to his audience. He raised the pistol with a theatrical flourish. Crack. A bottle exploded into a shower of dark green fragments. Crack. A second bottle vanished. Crack, 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 crack. 6 shots fired with a rapid, arrogant rhythm. 6 bottles gone. His crowd let out a ragged cheer. Fletcher blew imaginary smoke from the barrel of his gun and gave a slight bow, his eyes, finding Lillian's a look of cruel triumph in them. Then it was Owen's turn. He stepped to the line, his movements devoid of any flourish. He drew his own pistol. It was not a showpiece. It was a worn, blued steel Colt, a tool that had seen hard use, its wooden grip smooth from years of handling. He didn't look at the crowd. He didn't look at Fletcher. His world seemed to shrink, to narrow down to the front sight of his gun and the task at hand. He raised the pistol. There was no pause, no showmanship. His arm was as steady as the granite mountains on the horizon. 6 shots rang out so close together they sounded almost like a single rolling peal of thunder. On the fence post, 6 more bottles, freshly placed by the sheriff's deputy, disintegrated into dust and splinters. It was not just accurate. It was efficient. It was lethal. The cheering from the crowd was more subdued this time, replaced by a low murmur of shock and intrigue. Fletcher's smile tightened at the edges. From her place at the side, Lillian watched her hands clenched so tightly in the folds of her dress that her knuckles were white. When Owen had first stepped up, she had felt a fresh wave of despair. This stranger, this cruel, unreadable man was her only champion. A champion who had bought her humiliation. But watching him shoot, it was different. It was not the angry, prideful violence of Fletcher. It was a kind of grim, focused artistry. A terrible and beautiful control. A tiny, fragile seed of hope, a thing she thought had died with Samuel, began to stir within her. "Second round," the sheriff announced, his voice a little less certain now. He pinned a playing card, the Queen of Spades, to a wooden post. From the same distance, shoot the spade from the center. Fletcher stepped up again, his arrogance tempered with a new seriousness. He took his time, squinting, his tongue caught between his teeth in concentration. He fired. The shot was perfect, punching a clean hole directly through the black symbol, leaving the rest of the card untouched. He turned, a look of smug satisfaction returning to his face. "Not much for conversation, are you, stranger?" Fletcher taunted as Owen took his place. "All that skill and no style. A man ought to have a little flair." Owen ignored him. He raised his pistol. He fired. His shot did not punch a hole through the spade. It struck the edge of Fletcher's bullet hole, neatly tearing the card in half along the line of the symbol. The 2 halves of the Queen of Spades fluttered to the ground. A gasp went through the crowd. It was a shot of impossible, insulting precision. It was a statement. Lillian felt her breath catch in her throat. Her heart was a wild bird beating against the cage of her ribs. Hope. It was terrifying. Fletcher's face was now a mask of thunderous fury. He was no longer playing a game. He was being made a fool of in his own town. "Enough tricks," he snarled. "Sheriff, the final shot. Let's end this." Sheriff Cobb, visibly sweating now, hurried to a tall post where a rope was slung over a crossbeam. He pulled a silver pocket watch from his vest and tied it by its heavy chain to the end of the rope, setting it swinging in a slow, hypnotic arc. The final target, Cobb declared, his voice trembling slightly. The swinging chain. A single shot. Sever the chain without destroying the watch. "Fletcher, you are first." Fletcher's confidence returned. This was a legendary shot, a shot for marksmen of the highest caliber. He would not be beaten. He took a deep, steadying breath, raised his pistol, and tracked the swinging watch. The crowd was utterly silent. The only sound was the faint creak of the rope and the whisper of the wind. He fired. The bullet struck the body of the watch with a loud clang, shattering the porcelain face and sending gears flying. The watch, broken, remained hanging from the chain. An impressive shot, a destructive shot, but a failure. Fletcher cursed under his breath, but quickly composed himself. "Impossible," he declared to the crowd. "No man alive can hit a swinging chain that thin. The contest is a draw. The land is mine." Then Owen stepped forward for the final time. The setting sun cast his shadow long and dark across the ground. He did not raise his pistol immediately. He turned his head and looked directly at Marcus Fletcher, and his stormy eyes were filled with a cold, ancient light. My brother Owen, said his voice quiet but carrying with lethal clarity in the stillness, always said, "You had more pride than sense, Fletcher. The name of a brother." The first crack in his anonymous facade. Fletcher's face went pale with confusion. "What are you talking about? Who are you?" Owen gave him no answer. He turned his attention back to the target. He raised his Colt. Time seemed to slow. The world was the glint of sun on the brass chain, the perfect weight of the gun in his hand, the silent figure in white at the edge of his vision. He fired. There was no loud clang, only a sharp, high-pitched ping. For a second, nothing happened. Then the silver watch dropped from the air and landed softly in the dust. Its chain severed its body untouched. A wave of disbelief followed by a roar of astonishment swept through the crowd. Lillian's hand flew to her mouth, a sob of impossible, overwhelming hope escaping her lips. Owen Slade stood, impassive, smoke curling from the barrel of his gun. He had not just won. He had performed a miracle, and in doing so he had just signed his own death warrant or hers. Fletcher's face was no longer just angry. It was murderous. The world held its breath for a heartbeat suspended in the impossible aftermath of the shot. Then the silence shattered. A roar went up from the crowd, a wave of pure, unadulterated astonishment. They had not just seen a trick shot. They had witnessed a legend being unwritten. Marcus Fletcher stood frozen, his face a canvas of disbelief and blackening rage. His public authority, the fear he had so carefully cultivated, had been shot from the sky along with that silver watch chain. He turned his eyes, landing on Owen with a venom that was no longer veiled by arrogance. It was raw. It was murderous. "This is not over," Fletcher snarled, his voice a low, dangerous promise. He gestured subtly to his two ranch hands, who began to shift their hands, drifting towards the pistols on their hips. "No one makes a fool of me in my own town." Owen did not flinch. He calmly ejected the spent cartridge, the metallic scent of it sharp in the air, and holstered his Colt. He moved then not away but forward, placing himself squarely between Fletcher and Lillian, a silent granite shield. He walked to Sheriff Cobb, who looked pale and shaken, and took the deed to the Monroe Ranch from his trembling hand. Then he turned and walked directly toward Marcus Fletcher. The crowd quieted once more, sensing the true reckoning was at hand. This was no longer about land. It was about something deeper, something that had the bitter taste of old blood. Owen stopped directly in front of Fletcher, so close that the bigger man had to look down at him. Owen's voice was quiet, a cold, flat statement of fact. "You took his land with false debts. You took his pride with your whispers and your lies. You preyed on his grief, and when he was gone you came for his wife. You thought you'd buried him, and every memory of him." "I don't know what devil's talk you're spouting, stranger," Fletcher blustered, but his eyes held a flicker of panic. Owen's gaze was relentless. "I'm talking about Samuel Hayes." Lillian, standing by the post, heard the name of her husband, and her breath caught in a sob. Owen never took his eyes off Fletcher. "He was my brother," he said, and the three words landed with the force of a physical blow. "My full name is Owen Hayes, and the Hayes family always pays its debts." The truth exploded into the clearing. Every cruel action, every strange demand suddenly reconfigured itself in Lillian's mind. The stranger who had shamed her was not a stranger at all. He was family. He had forced her to wear the dress not to mark her as a possession, but to raise a flag of defiance, a symbol of the very honor he had come to defend. The entire ordeal had been a righteous, painful, beautiful lie. Fletcher was speechless, the color drained from his face. He was not facing a nameless drifter anymore. He was facing a ghost, a debt of blood and honor he could never pay. He looked at the hard, unforgiving eyes of Owen Hayes, then at the faces of the townsfolk who were now staring at him with dawning, cold contempt. His power had vanished. Without another word, Fletcher turned and stalked away, his men following like chastened dogs. Owen watched him go, then turned. He walked back to Lillian, who stood trembling, her hand pressed to her mouth. The setting sun was at his back, casting him in shadow. He stopped before her and held out the crumpled paper. "This is yours, Lillian," he said, his voice softer than she had ever heard it. "He would have wanted you to have it." The crowd parted for them as they left the shooting range, their whispers now a mixture of awe and shame. They walked back toward the small ranch house, the setting sun painting the dust clouds in hues of rose and gold. They didn't speak. The silence between them was no longer the heavy, cautious stillness of strangers, but something new, a shared space, fragile and uncertain. Owen waited on the porch while Lillian went inside. Moments later, she returned the pouch of gold coins in her hand. She held it out to him. "This is yours. You paid for it." He looked at the gold, then back at her face, illuminated by the soft evening light. He gently pushed her hand away. "No, it's not," he said. It never was. It was just the price of admission. He had come to settle a debt of honor, and honor had no price tag. She stood before him, still in the wedding dress, a ghost of the past and a warrior of the present. The dress was smudged with dust and her own tears, but it had never looked more beautiful. It was a banner of survival. "What will you do now?" she asked, her voice quiet. He looked out at the vast, darkening plains, the endless horizon that had been his only home for so long. The life of a wanderer, a man defined by who he was hunting or who he was running from, suddenly felt profoundly empty. He had come here to put his brother's ghost to rest, but in doing so he had found his own. "Samuel. He wrote to me a few times." Owen said, his voice a low rumble, telling a story he hadn't shared with anyone. He wasn't much for words, but he wrote about this place, about the way the sun hits that ridge at dawn, about building this house with his own two hands. "For you." He finally turned to look at her, his stormy eyes holding a raw, unguarded vulnerability. "A ranch needs more than one pair of hands to make it a home, Lillian. And a promise to a brother. It's more than just land. It's about seeing his legacy live on." He took a step closer, his gaze dropping to the dress. "That dress. It deserves more than just sad memories. It deserves new ones." He looked up, his eyes meeting hers, holding them. "Let me stay. Not as a stranger, not as a ghost. Let me help you build this place back the way he would have wanted. Let us build it together." It was not a declaration of love, not a whirlwind romance. It was something quieter and infinitely more real. It was a proposal of partnership, of shared burdens, of two broken souls finding a place to heal. Lillian looked at this man, this ghost of her husband's family who had walked out of the dust and fought a battle for her honor. She looked at the home Samuel had built, and she saw a future, not just an ending. A new beginning, she whispered the words, tasting of hope. A true, tremulous smile touched her lips for the first time. He didn't ride away. He stayed. And in the quiet work of mending fences, tending the land, and sharing silent cups of coffee on the porch at dawn, they built a new life from the ashes of the old one. The wedding dress was carefully packed away, not as a relic of a love that was lost, but as the foundation of a love that was found.